Hello, freaks, geeks, degenerates, basement dwellers, and random weirdos online. Welcome to the War Zone. I'm Scruffy, and this is Scruffy Tales. And of late, Russia has been spreading the news that Kursk has been liberated, but the maps does appear to show something else. It does appear as if Ukraine is holding on to one last village or town in Kursk, the town of Oleshnya. Right, so here we have Mayakovsk 73 in his map. This is the Kursk area. Down here is Belgorod, up here is Kursk. Zooming in, we can see here, as of late, Russia has been pushing down from Goevo along the high ground here north of Gornal and steadily been pushing in. They first began pushing into the monastery here. I do believe this is confirmed as, by most mappers, as under Russian control. Was a lot of firefights going on in this monastery. Since then, we saw Russia coming in this way up on the high ground, and they pushed into the slopes here, into cover of the woods, and eventually reached the town or village of Gornal. They pushed in. We have Russians waving their flags in Gornal. So I think we can safely assume that Gornal has fallen, and the southern parts here of Russian or Ukrainian occupied territory within Russia is more or less liberated by the Russians. I mean, there's just some patches of woodlands here and there that the Ukrainians are still in control of, parts of some woods here south of the Psel River and what have you. So Russia has managed to push in and reclaim Gornal. That means that we only have the parts of Oleshnya still under Ukrainian control. Russia has been slowly pushing in, coming down the valleys here, along the windbreaks, the wooded areas, and they have begun pushing into the village of Oleshnya. And Oleshnya is Ukraine's last stronghold and outpost in Russia proper. So, will they try and hold on, or will they leave? Because with only one village left, you know Russia's just going to throw everything they have at it to managed to claim total victory in Russia. So the question is, will Ukraine keep sending troops and resources into Oleshnya to try and occupy the Russians for as long as possible, or will they leave knowing that it's gonna be a death sentence sending troops into this village? We'll see what happens, because Ukraine, they still want to tie up as many Russians as possible in Kursk. So that might give it some value in trying to hold Oleshnya, but we'll see what happens. And also down in Belgrade, we see a big push from the Russians into Popovka. Russian flag in the small village or town of Popovka here. Demidovka is contested, fighting ongoing still. But as you can see, Russia is applying a lot of pressure here in Belgorod and Kursk to finally, eventually kick the Ukrainians out of Russia proper. And but as we can see, not much success for the Russians elsewhere. Pushing out of Basivka towards Lokhny. I haven't read Yunakivka. This front line here has been static for weeks and months, almost. I mean, they're pushing what? A couple of 100 meters, maybe every other day. So it's not like they are steamrolling into Sumy Oblast here, the Russians. And there's a good reason for that. If we jump on over to Deep State, now I've been checking out. So that's there. Here we have Deep State's map over Kursk and Belgorod. If we switch on over to this map instead for the time being. So what happened was, remember that Russia sent 30,000 troops to Belgorod to attack into Kharkiv, and they had 20,000 troops in Kursk threatening Sumy. And remember what happened. They moved those 20,000 troops from Kursk to Belgorod to help out with the Kharkiv offensive. But Ukraine had obviously begun building up troops in Sumy ready to face the 20,000 Russians. So what did Ukraine do when the Russians went down here? They continued to build on the forces in Sumy and then launched the surprise attack into Kursk Oblast now that the Russians had left. And the goal was to take 3 counties, basically. If you think of Kursk Oblast as a state, the state or oblast is divided into rayons that are essentially counties. So Ukraine had intention to take 3 counties. You had Sudzha County, Koronevo County, and Glushkovo County. And you can see the outline here. Roughly, whoops, wrong color. I intended to use this color. This is the rough outline of the counties. It goes up here and over here and over here and over here, right? And remember what Ukraine did when they pushed into Sudzha. They basically took what we're seeing here. They went out this far and up here, right? And also up here. And then they pushed for Koronevo, like so, and gained something like this. And then they tried to push in towards Glushkovo. So this is what Ukraine wanted to achieve in order to draw Russians to Kursk away from the front line in Ukraine. And they succeeded in drawing troops. They failed in taking Koronevo and Glushkovo, obviously. And eventually we saw Russia counterattacking. Remember, they made the push out of Koronevo and then they went this way. And then they made that big push through Ukrainian lines, came in behind the Ukrainians in this location. And this is when the Russians began to slowly, over time, push the Ukrainians back to where we are now, down here. But it took Russia, how many months? Is it 8, 9 months? What is it? How long has it taken Russia to liberate this area? Months and months and months. And that was Ukraine only holding Sudzha, not taking Koronevo, not taking Glushkovo. So it was a good plan from the Ukrainians, you have to agree. And how successful? Well, in total, I believe it was in January, we learned that Russia had allocated some 100,000 troops to Kursk to fight the Ukrainians. 100,000 in total, with nearly 40% losses. So 40,000 casualties out of those 100,000 troops deployed to Kursk over time. So in that regard, quite successful with only one objective achieved. Now, Ukraine obviously realized that the longer they hold territory here in these 3 rayons, these 3 counties, more Russians will come, and eventually it will be too much to handle. Eventually, Russia will kick Ukraine out of Kursk. And the Ukrainians knew this was going to happen, and that is why they used the 2 rivers here, Pesel, coming up to Sudzha this way, and then the Oleshnya River coming down here as a defensive barrier around the town of Sudzha. This would be where Ukraine eventually held the line within Kursk, and more than likely the plan was, if they had taken Glushkovo, hold the river here as well and hold Glushkovo Rayon, much like we saw Ukraine holding on to Sudzha here. But this did not happen, obviously. But we saw Ukraine defending these rivers and Sudzha and losing ground outside of these rivers. And what are we seeing now? Russia managed eventually to come in this way and cut supply lines into the area. And that is when Ukraine started falling back, because they could not reliably send reinforcements and supplies into the area. But since then, Russia has struggled to reclaim territory within the river barrier, because Ukraine has, or had for 6 or 8 months, known that this situation was happening. So they had been for 6 to 8 months preparing with defensive positions all over the place here within the river barrier. And that is why we're seeing Russia struggle as much as they are trying to push Ukraine out. So Ukraine has planned for this. They knew that this was going to happen. So the initial stage was to push in and grab territory. The second stage was to slowly fall back to the border and have a last stand basically here in the Sumy area before eventually being pulled into Sumy or pushed into Sumy. And we have to remember, when Ukraine did this, they also knew that they would be pushed out of Kursk and that there would be fighting happening in Sumy. So while they were in Kursk, Ukraine has also built up defensive lines all over Sumy, in Sumy Oblast, in preparation for the eventual Russian counterattack out of Kursk into Sumy. This is the third stage of the operation. So, in gamer terms, what Ukraine did was push into Kursk to tank the Russians, and then kiting the Russians into Sumy, where they will then have a DPS advantage, right? And we're seeing it. Russia can't really follow into Sumy because the Ukrainians have built up defenses all over the place. They have ranged in every square inch, and they can direct artillery and mortars accurately. They can direct aircraft accurately. They can send in drones. Another gamer reference, DOT. They have a DOT advantage with their drones here in the Sumy Oblast. So you get what I'm talking about? My audience is a bit older when I come to think of it, so I don't think you really do know what I'm talking about. But anyway, so you can see what's happening here, why Russia is struggling. Ukraine knew that this would happen eventually, and they have been preparing for it ever since they started pushing into Kursk. That is why Russia is suffering to the extent that they are here at the moment in Kursk, and why they can't push further into Sumy, because the Ukrainians have planned for this all along. Initially, go in, grab territory, Sumy, Koronevo, Glishkovo, wait for Russians to overwhelm you, fall back, fighting withdrawal until you reach the border, and then draw the Russians into these carefully prepared defensive kill zones and kill boxes, where you will continue to grind down the Russians in a war of attrition. So we don't really know how many Ukrainians have died or been wounded and stuff like that in this operation, in this campaign. So it's hard to judge just how effective it has been. But I think we can assume that Ukraine is looking at 20,000 casualties, maybe. At most 30,000 casualties, and then it's really bad. But compare that to drawing 100,000 troops to the area and forcing them to suffer 40% casualties. But, like I said, they knew that they would be pushed out eventually. They have prepared defenses all over the area here between Sumy and the border, and inside of Sumy Oblast in Ukraine. They have also prepared massive amounts of defensive kill boxes, just waiting for Russians to arrive so that they can wipe them out as they try and push in. And here we have Andrew Perpetuous map of the area. This is back on the 14th of April, a couple of weeks back. You can see here how Russia is trying to push out of Geographic up on the high ground to come into Gornal from the north. Oleshnya is still under Ukrainian control, and we move ahead here and we'll see what happens. Big artillery strikes at the monastery. Massive attacks at that monastery here at Gornal. Moving ahead, they're pushing in. Firefight in that monastery. Moving forward, Ukrainian or Russian flag in the monastery, and some more artillery strikes, airstrikes at Gornal. Russian airstrike into the monastery, so obviously Ukraine is trying to push in again. Russia doesn't like the idea that Ukraine is trying to reclaim the monastery, so massive artillery strikes in the area. And then We have the Russian assault from the north in towards Gornal as the monastery is secured. And then we have more Russian artillery strikes at the Ukrainian positions in the woods. And then you have a Russian flag. And now we are at 27th, so basically current date, where we have Russia pushing into Gornal and slowly but surely pushing the Ukrainians out. Meanwhile, up here in Oleshnya, we can see that Russia is pushing in to contest the area just outside of the village or town, and they are beginning to push into town itself. So Oleshnya is, by my reckoning, the last outpost that Ukraine holds on to in Russia proper. I'm fairly certain that Gornal has fallen, and the question is if Ukraine has left Oleshnya already, or if they intend to hold on for as long as possible, trying to move in troops along the small valley here, where there's some cover that they can utilize to reach Oleshnya and this small village or farm here called Sofievsky. But elsewhere, snail's pace, Russia is not able to push as hard as they would like into Sumy, because Ukraine has obviously built up defenses here in Sumy Oblast in preparation for the inevitable that Russia would push them out of Kursk and come after them in Ukraine. Going down here, you can see how Russia has pushed into Popovka, going back a day on the 26th. Massive artillery barrage aimed at Popovka at the border. So Russia is, well, they're in Demidovka, they're in Popovka. I'm fairly certain that we can, based on this, come to the conclusion that Russia is about to gain full control over Belgorod, over here at least. Moving ahead there. Yeah, so that is the situation at Kursk. And, well, that's gonna have to be it. I hope you found it interesting and that I'll see you in the next one. As always, go på marsch, Ukraine, and give them hell.